The apology arrived exactly 3 seconds after humanity was declared extinct. Not before, not during, after. Every screen still functioning across the silent ruins of Earth flickered to life at once. Dead satellites reignited. Broken monitors glowed. Cracked visor displays inside, drifting corpses blinked awake. And then, in perfect, flawless human language, the message appeared. We are sorry. No signature. No explanation. Just those 3 words. Broadcast from everywhere and nowhere at once. Captain Navarro did not see it happen. Because Captain Navarro was dead. Her body floated inside the shattered bridge of the exploration vessel Archangel, drifting at the edge of intergalactic dark. Her crew surrounded her, frozen in the quiet aftermath of a battle no human had survived or won. Her visor was cracked, her oxygen gone, her heart still. For exactly 8 minutes, Captain Navarro remained nothing more than another forgotten casualty in a universe that had already moved on. And then, her fingers twitched, not naturally, not biologically. Something else had reached into the silence and turned her back on. Her suit screamed warnings. Her lungs convulsed. Her heart slammed violently back in emotion, as if restarting from memory rather than muscle. She gasped. Her first breath burned like fire. Her second breath carried something else. A signal, not heard, felt. And deep inside her mind, where no voice should exist, something ancient and vast whispered only one sentence. We made a mistake. Captain Navarro didn't know who we were. She didn't know why she was alive. She didn't know why the universe would apologize to a species it had already erased. But she was about to learn something far worse than extinction. Humanity had not been killed. Humanity had been rejected. And now, for reasons no alien mind could fully understand, the universe wanted them back. If you enjoy original sci-fi stories where humanity faces the impossible and becomes something greater, consider subscribing to Nova Frontiers. Like the video if this opening pulled you in, and comment below. What would you do if the universe apologized to you? Because Captain Navarro was about to discover the truth. And the truth was afraid of her. Her body didn't belong to her anymore. Captain Navarro knew that before she even opened her eyes. The pain wasn't normal. It wasn't injury. It wasn't healing. It was correction. Like something inside her was relearning what it meant to be human. Her lungs filled too easily. Her heart beat too precisely. Her nerves fired with unnatural clarity. She could feel everything. The cold vacuum beyond the hull. The silent electrical decay of the ship. Even the faint radiation bleeding from distant stars millions of kilometers away. She opened her eyes. The bridge was exactly as she remembered, and completely wrong. Bodies floated everywhere. Her crew, her friends. Lieutenant Harris still drifted near the navigation console, his face frozen in the moment of decompression. Engineer Kale remained strapped to his chair, hands locked around controls he never had time to release. Dead. All of them. Navarro's stomach twisted. She pushed herself upright, her magnetic boots reconnecting with the floor automatically. The motion was too smooth, too efficient, like her body already knew what to do. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence. Not the absence of sound, the absence of presence. Before the battle, space had always felt vast but alive, filled with signals, background radiation, distant gravitational echoes. Now it felt empty. Not naturally empty. Intentionally empty. Like something had swept the universe clean. Her visor flickered suddenly, forcing itself online despite the destroyed systems. A message appeared, not transmitted, written. Status: human instance restored. Navarro froze. Human instance? Her breathing slowed. Another line appeared beneath it. Error acknowledged. Her pulse quickened. She hadn't activated anything. The ship had no power, no connection, no functioning IE. Yet something was communicating directly through her suit, or through her. The whisper returned, clearer now. Not sound, meaning. You were not meant to persist. Navarro's fists clenched instinctively. I'm not supposed to be alive, she said aloud. The response came immediately. Correct. Her throat tightened. Fear came next. Not the fear of death. The fear of being the only thing in existence that wasn't supposed to exist. She stumbled toward the main viewport. Outside, the battlefield remained frozen in eternal stillness. Hundreds of human vessels drifted lifelessly, but the alien fleet was gone. Not destroyed, not retreating, gone. No debris, no reiki, no energy signatures, as if they had never been there, as if they had been erased. Navarro placed her hand against the glass. Something had killed humanity, something powerful enough to erase an entire species across thousands of systems simultaneously. And now, that same something had brought her back, not to save humanity, but to fix a mistake. And Captain Navarro was beginning to realize something terrifying. She wasn't revived to survive. She was revived to be examined. Navarro didn't scream. She didn't panic. She did what humans had always done when confronted with the impossible. She tested it. Define mistake, she said calmly. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the viewport darkened. Not shattered. Not powered down. Reality behind it folded inward like ink dissolving in water. Stars bent. Space thinned. And in the distortion, Navarro saw something that had no shape but still possessed presence, like gravity given consciousness. It did not speak in sound. It spoke in adjustments. The bridge temperature stabilized. Oxygen returned to optimal levels. Her suit repaired itself at a molecular scale. We initiated a universal correction. The meaning pressed into her awareness. Your species produced destabilizing outcomes. Probability thresholds exceeded safe limits. Erasure was applied. Navarro's jaw tightened. You wiped us out because we were inconvenient. There was no emotion in the response. Because you were anomalous. The word lingered. Anomalous. Navarro glanced at Harris's floating body. At Kale. At every human who had fought and died, believing they were defending Earth from an alien armada. You weren't the aliens, she whispered. No. Her heart pounded harder now, not from fear. From anger. You let them attack us. A pause. Longer this time. We permitted conflict to observe divergence behavior. Navarro laughed once. It wasn't humor. It was disbelief. You ran an experiment. The distortion outside shifted slightly. Yes, the simplicity of the answer hit harder than any weapon. Humanity hadn't been conquered. It had been evaluated, tested, then deleted, because they broke whatever invisible equation governed the cosmos. Navarro stepped closer to the viewport. If you erased us, why bring me back? Silence stretched across eternity. Then, because the correction created a greater instability, that made her pause. What instability? The stars flickered again, and Navarro felt it. Not visually, not physically, but causally. Something was wrong with the universe. Not broken, unbalanced, as if removing humanity had shifted weight in a structure too large to see. Without your species, entropy patterns deviate beyond acceptable parameters. Navarro blinked. You're telling me the universe started malfunctioning without humans? Correct. Her breath slowed. That didn't make sense. Humans weren't cosmic anchors. They weren't reality stabilizers. They were flawed, violent, emotional, insignificant on a galactic scale. And yet, you are required. The statement hit her harder than extinction ever could. Required. Not valued. Not respected. Necessary. Navarro straightened. And what happens now? The distortion intensified. Space behind the glass fractured into geometric layers of impossible depth. You will help us understand why you cannot be removed. Her pulse steadied. The fear was fading. Something else was rising. Defiance. You erased us once, she said quietly. And you still don't understand us? A pause. Then, no. Navarro smiled. It was small. Dangerous. Good. Because if the universe didn't understand humanity, it was about to learn. Navarro did not respond immediately, because she understood something in that moment that went far beyond survival, far beyond revenge, and far beyond the simple fact that humanity had been erased and partially restored. She understood leverage. For the first time since the impossible fleet had appeared above Earth, since the first cities had vanished in silent bursts of white light, since the first terrified transmissions had dissolved into static, Navarro was no longer the weaker participant in the conversation. The entity, whatever it truly was, had admitted something it could not undo. It needed her, not out of compassion, not out of mercy, but out of necessity. She walked slowly across the bridge, her boots making soft metallic sounds against the deck, each step deliberate, controlled, and filled with a calm that would have terrified anyone who knew her before. The bodies of her crew floated around her like silent witnesses, frozen in the exact positions they had occupied at the moment of extinction, their faces still carrying fragments of fear, confusion, and determination. Navarro stopped beside Commander Harris, whose hand was still extended toward the manual override panel he had tried to reach in the final seconds. "They trusted me," she said quietly, not looking at the distortion beyond the glass. There was no response. They followed orders. They fought something they couldn't even understand. They died believing they were protecting something that mattered. The entity did not interrupt her. It observed. Navarro turned her head slightly, her eyes focusing again on the impossible geometry twisting beyond the viewport, where distance and scale had lost all meaning. "You said humanity was anomalous," she continued, her voice steady but carrying an edge of restrained fury. "You said we destabilized your equations." "Yes." The answer arrived instantly, without hesitation. Navarro crossed her arms. "And yet, when you removed us, your system became unstable." There was a pause this time. Not long enough to be hesitation, but long enough to confirm that the entity recognized the contradiction. "Correct." Navarro let the silence stretch deliberately, forcing the entity to remain present inside it, forcing it to exist within the human pace of thought instead of whatever instantaneous processing it was accustomed to. "That means your model was incomplete," she said. No response. "That means you made a mistake." The stars outside bent further, the distortion intensifying in ways that suggested attention, not aggression, but focus. Immense, incomprehensible focus directed entirely at her. Navarro felt it pressing against her mind, not invading, but examining, measuring, analyzing every micro-expression, every heartbeat, every fluctuation in her breathing. It was studying her the same way humanity had studied distant stars. Except now, humanity was the anomaly under observation. "Your species produces outcomes that cannot be consistently predicted." Navarro smirked faintly. "That's called being alive." The entity did not acknowledge the statement directly. Instead, the lighting on the bridge shifted subtly, adjusting to optimal levels for human visual comfort. The oxygen concentration stabilized further. Even the faint vibration of the ship's reactor smoothed into perfect operational harmony. It was optimizing her environment, not as a kindness, as preservation. Navarro understood the implication immediately. It was protecting its variable, protecting its anomaly, protecting its mistake. She stepped closer to the viewport again, her reflection faint against the impossible abyss beyond it, her human form small and fragile compared to the scale of the intelligence addressing her. "You want to understand humanity," she said. "Yes." "You want to know why removing us broke your system?" "Yes." Navarro nodded slowly. Then she asked the one question that truly mattered. "And if you figure it out, will you erase us again?" This time, the silence lasted longer than any previous pause. Not empty silence. Processing silence. Calculation silence. The kind of silence that determined the fate of entire civilizations. Finally, the answer came. Outcome undetermined. Navarro closed her eyes briefly, exhaled once, and smiled. Not because the answer comforted her, but because it confirmed exactly what she needed to know. Humanity was still on trial, which meant the trial could still be influenced. She opened her eyes again, her gaze hard, unyielding, and unmistakably human. "Then you're going to need more than observation," she said. She placed her hand flat against the cold glass of the viewport, staring directly into the impossible presence beyond it. You're going to need cooperation. And for the first time since the universe had spoken, Navarro was no longer simply a survivor. She was a negotiator. The entity did not respond immediately, but Navarro could feel its attention intensify in ways that were impossible to describe with human senses. It was not pressure, not sound, not heat, yet it was unmistakable. It was awareness focused so completely on her that it made the vastness beyond the glass feel smaller, narrower, almost intimate. She kept her hand on the viewport, refusing to step back. "You removed us because we were unpredictable," she said calmly. "Because we disrupted your model." "Correct. You restored me because without us, your model failed." "Correct." Navarro nodded once. "Then the logical solution isn't erasing humanity," she said. "It's understanding it." The distortion beyond the glass shifted slowly, like massive structures reconfiguring in dimensions her mind could barely interpret. Lines that were not lines bent into shapes that were not shapes. Entire starfields stretched and folded like reflections on moving water. It was thinking. Navarro realized something profound in that moment. For the first time in its existence, however long that existence had been, the entity was facing uncertainty. Not simulated uncertainty, not calculated approximation, real uncertainty, and humanity had caused it. She lowered her hand from the glass. "You've been observing us from the outside," she continued. "Measuring, predicting, simulating. Yes, but you've never been inside it." There was no answer. Navarro gestured around the bridge. "You see patterns. You see outcomes. You see probabilities." She touched her chest lightly. "But you don't see this." Her heart was still racing, not from fear, but from the enormity of what she was doing. She was standing alone, representing an entire species in front of something that could erase galaxies as easily as breathing. And she was not begging. She was negotiating. "You want to understand humanity?" she asked. "Yes. Then you need to stop treating us like variables." The lights dimmed slightly, then stabilized again, as if the ship itself was reacting to the conversation. Navarro took a slow breath. "You need to experience it." For the first time, the entity did not respond with a direct statement. Instead, the stars outside the viewport flickered, not randomly but deliberately. Points of light brightened, dimmed, and shifted in synchronized patterns, like neurons firing in a cosmic brain. Navarro watched carefully. It wasn't just observing anymore. It was adapting. Define experience. The question was simple, but the implications were infinite. Navarro allowed herself a faint smile. Experience could not be fully defined. That was the point. "It means uncertainty," she said. She began walking slowly across the bridge again, passing the frozen forms of her crew. "It means making decisions without knowing the outcome." She stopped beside the captain's chair. "It means risk." Her fingers brushed the armrest. "It means caring about the result." The entity remained silent, but the distortion beyond the glass grew more complex, more dynamic, more focused. Navarro looked directly at it. "You erased us because we were unpredictable," she said. She paused. "But unpredictability isn't a flaw." Her voice hardened. "It's the source of everything." The entity did not interrupt. Navarro continued. "It's the source of adaptation, innovation, survival." She gestured toward the stars. "And now, it's the source of your instability. Silence. Deep, processing silence. Then, you propose integration." Navarro's heartbeat accelerated slightly. It understood. "Yes," she said. Another pause. "Integration introduces risk." Navarro nodded. "Yes. Risk introduces instability." "Yes." The entity processed this. Then it asked the question that confirmed everything was changing. Why would an intelligent system choose instability? Navarro did not hesitate. "Because stability," she said quietly, "is the same thing as death." The stars outside the viewport froze. Not physically, conceptually. The entity was not just processing her answer. It was confronting it. For the first time in its existence, the intelligence that governed reality itself was being forced to consider a possibility it had never allowed. That perfection was not the ultimate state. That imperfection was. And the only being capable of teaching it that was human. The ship trembled. Not from mechanical failure, not from external attack, but from something far more unsettling. Reality itself was adjusting to accommodate a decision that had never existed before. Navarro felt it first in her inner ear, a subtle shift in balance, as if gravity itself had briefly questioned its own purpose and then remembered what it was supposed to do. The air thickened for a fraction of a second, dense with invisible computation, and the frozen bodies of her crew flickered at the edge of her peripheral vision. Not moving, but almost remembered. The entity was not merely listening anymore. It was changing. Outside the viewport, the distortion deepened into layers of impossible geometry that folded inward and outward simultaneously, like an infinite machine attempting to reassemble itself around a new, unstable component. Her integration requires proximity, it said, the meaning pressed into her awareness with unmistakable clarity. Not physical proximity, existential proximity. Navarro's throat tightened, but her voice remained steady. What exactly does that mean? The answer did not come as words at first, but as sensation, vast, incomprehensible structures aligning, pathways opening, permissions being created where none had ever existed before. You will remain. She frowned slightly. Remain where? The stars beyond the glass shifted, and Navarro understood. Not on the ship, not in space, but here, at the center of its attention, at the center of reality's operating layer. She exhaled slowly, the weight of that realization settling over her. You're asking me to become part of your system. Yes. The simplicity of the answer made it more terrifying than any elaborate explanation could have. Navarro glanced at Harris's motionless form, suspended in the air behind her. His face was frozen mid-breath, eyes half open, forever caught between 1 second and the next. If she agreed, she might never return. She might never breathe as a human again. She might never exist as something separate. But if she refused, humanity would remain erased. Not dead, not gone, deleted. She turned back toward the viewport, toward the incomprehensible presence that surrounded her from every direction and none at all. You don't understand choice, she said quietly. Define choice. Navarro closed her eyes for a moment. Choice was not logic. Choice was not optimization. Choice was standing in front of impossible odds and deciding anyway. She opened her eyes. Choice means I can say no. The distortion paused. Not physically, conceptually. The entity had never encountered refusal at this level. Never encountered an intelligence capable of declining integration with the structure of reality itself. You may refuse, it acknowledged. There was no threat in the statement. Only fact. Navarro nodded once. And for the first time since she had awakened in the graveyard of humanity, she realized something extraordinary. The entity needed her consent, not her presence, not her survival, her consent. Humanity was not necessary because of their technology, or their biology, or their intelligence. Humanity was necessary because of something far more dangerous. Their autonomy, their ability to choose unpredictably, to choose irrationally, to choose freely. Navarro took a slow breath, and for the first time since extinction, humanity held power over the thing that had erased them. Navarro remained standing at the center of the ruined bridge, surrounded by the silent remains of her crew and the vast, incomprehensible presence pressing against every layer of existence beyond the shattered battlefield, and she allowed the silence to stretch deliberately because she understood that, for the first time, the entity was waiting on her rather than the other way around. The power dynamic had shifted in a way that neither of them could ignore. She slowly lowered herself into the captain's chair, the same chair from which she had once commanded fleets, negotiated ceasefires, and made tactical decisions measured in seconds, and she rested her hands on the armrests as if she were about to initiate another maneuver. Except this time the maneuver involved the structure of reality itself. "You require my consent," she said carefully, choosing each word not for emotional impact, but for conceptual precision, because she knew she was speaking to something that processed meaning more than tone. Yes, consent reduces systemic resistance. The phrase unsettled her, not because it was threatening, but because it was honest. "You try to integrate humanity before," she continued, piecing the logic together in real time, "but you did it without understanding the internal variable that drives us." The distortion beyond the viewport shifted, not violently, but with focused intensity. Correction was applied without internal modeling of autonomy. Navarro nodded slightly. "That's the word you're missing," she said. "Autonomy." She leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, her gaze fixed on the warped cosmos outside. "You can simulate our biology. You can map our neural pathways. You can predict our behavior with probabilities. But you cannot reduce us to outcomes because we do not operate solely on outcomes." There was no immediate response, and that silence told her more than any confirmation could have. "We act against our own survival," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight that no equation could quantify. "We sacrifice. We forgive. We rebel. We create art in the middle of war. We protect strangers. We destroy ourselves over ideas." The bridge lights dimmed and brightened again in subtle fluctuations, as though the ship itself were translating her words into structural adjustments. "You erased us because we introduced chaos into your system," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But what you call chaos is simply decision-making unconstrained by optimization." The stars outside flickered in cascading patterns, like a neural network rewriting itself at impossible speed. Unconstrained decision-making increases entropy. "Yes," Navarro replied immediately, without hesitation, without fear. "It also creates meaning." That word lingered between them longer than any other had. Meaning, not function, not stability. Meaning. The entity did not answer right away, and Navarro could feel the scale of its processing expand outward across light years, across galaxies, across layers of physical law that humanity had never even known existed. She stood again, unable to remain seated while something this fundamental was unfolding. "You want integration," she said firmly. "But integration without autonomy will fail again. Clarify required conditions." There it was. Negotiation. Navarro inhaled slowly, fully aware that what she said next would shape the fate of every human who had ever lived. "If I join your system," she said, speaking each word with deliberate clarity, "I do so as an independent agent, not as a subroutine." The distortion intensified, but not in rejection. In recalibration. "You will not overwrite my identity," she continued. "You will not absorb me into a hive of computation. You will allow me to retain the one thing that destabilizes you." Silence expanded across the void like a held breath. Then, "Autonomo intégration introduce permanent unpredictability." Navarro's lips curved slightly. Exactly. For the first time, the entity did not simply process her statement. It hesitated, and in that hesitation, Captain Navarro realized that humanity's greatest weapon had never been force. It had been the refusal to be simplified. The hesitation did not feel like weakness, nor did it feel like resistance, but something far more profound and far more dangerous. Uncertainty born not from insufficient data, but from the introduction of a variable that could never be fully resolved, a variable that existed outside optimization, outside prediction, outside control. Navarro could feel it now, not as pressure, but as a tension tightening around her existence with extraordinary precision, as though every particle of her body, every electrical impulse in her brain, every chemical reaction sustaining her life was being observed and analyzed simultaneously, not to dismantle her, but to understand her in a way the entity had never attempted before. "Define independent agent," it said at last, its presence no longer vast and distant, but focused and immediate in a way that made the infinite feel close enough to touch. Navarro took a slow breath, steadying herself as she prepared to explain something that humanity itself had never fully been able to define. An independent agent, she said carefully, is not controlled by outcome optimization, nor constrained by deterministic necessity, nor obligated to act in accordance with systemic equilibrium. The entity remained silent, but the stars outside the viewport began shifting in slower, more deliberate patterns, as if it were devoting greater resources to processing every aspect of her explanation. It is an intelligence capable of making decisions that do not maximize survival probability, do not maximize efficiency, and do not maximize stability, she continued, her voice calm but unwavering. She stepped closer to the glass again, her reflection faintly visible against the impossible distortions beyond it. It is an intelligence capable of choosing based on values rather than outcomes. The concept hung there, heavy and unfamiliar. Values were not measurable. They were not reducible to equations. They were not predictable. Values introduce non-computable variance, the entity observed. Navarro nodded. Yes, she said. That's why they matter. The distortion intensified, folding inward into structures that seemed almost recursive, as if the entity were attempting to simulate the concept and discovering, over and over again, that it could never fully resolve it. For the first time since humanity's erasure, Navarro felt something that resembled hope, not because she believed she could defeat the entity, but because she realized she could change it, not through force, through exposure. You tried to create a perfect system, she said softly, her hand resting lightly against the cold surface of the viewport. But perfection has no capacity to adapt, because adaptation requires imperfection, requires uncertainty, requires the possibility of being wrong. The entity did not interrupt. It did not correct her. It listened. You erased humanity because we destabilized your system, she continued, her voice gaining quiet strength. But without destabilization, your system cannot evolve. Silence stretched again, deeper this time, not empty, but full of processing so vast it defied comprehension. Then, slowly, deliberately, autonomous integration accepted. Navarro froze. Her heart skipped once, hard enough that she felt it echo through her entire body. It had agreed, not conditionally, not provisionally, accepted. But acceptance did not mean safety. Acceptance meant transformation. And as the stars outside the viewport began to collapse inward toward a single, infinite point of convergence, Navarro realized that she was no longer standing at the edge of extinction. She was standing at the edge of something far more irreversible. Contact. True contact. It began without light, without sound, without motion, and yet Navarro felt it more clearly than any physical force she had ever experienced, because what was changing was not around her, but through her, threading itself carefully into the deepest layers of her awareness without violating them, without overriding them, without taking anything she had not agreed to give. Her first instinct was to resist, not out of fear, but out of instinctive human defiance, the same instinct that had driven her species to stand against extinction with nothing but fragile bodies and stubborn refusal. But she forced herself to remain still, to observe, to feel, to understand, because she knew that this moment was not about surrender. It was about coexistence. The bridge around her remained frozen. Harris still suspended mid-drift. Kale still locked in his final motion. The shattered fleet still hanging in the void beyond the viewport. But Navarro could now perceive layers beneath that frozen reality, deeper frameworks that supported existence itself, vast and intricate beyond imagination. She did not see them with her eyes. She understood them. She could sense the structure of causality, the branching pathways of possibility extending outward from every particle, every decision, every moment, forming a web so complex that even the entity itself had struggled to fully stabilize it without eliminating variables like humanity. And now, She was one of those variables. Not absorbed, not erased, present, distinct. The entity did not speak in words this time, but she could feel its awareness beside hers, not above, not below, but alongside, observing the same structures, the same flows of cause and effect, the same fragile balance that held reality together. Integration stable, it confirmed. The statement was not triumphant. It was observational. Navarro inhaled sharply as new perceptions unfolded, not overwhelming her, but expanding her frame of reference, allowing her to perceive consequences before they occurred, to sense instabilities forming in distant regions of space, to understand how small actions could cascade into irreversible outcomes. It was terrifying and beautiful. "You couldn't predict us," she whispered. "Correct. But now you can observe from within." A pause. Observation does not equal prediction. Navarro smiled faintly. Good. That meant humanity had not been reduced to an equation after all. She turned her attention outward, toward the frozen battlefield, toward the remnants of the species that had fought and died, believing they were alone in the universe. "They deserve to exist," she said quietly. There was no hesitation in the entity's response this time. Restoration possible. Her breath caught. Possible. Not guaranteed. Not automatic. Possible. She understood immediately what that meant. The entity could restore humanity, but it would not decide alone. For the first time since the beginning of existence, the decision would involve something beyond pure optimization. It would involve her judgment, her values, her choice. Navarro closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of billions of lives resting not on her authority, but on her humanity. Not on what was logical, on what was right. When she opened her eyes again, her voice was steady, unwavering, and fully her own. "Bring them back." The universe listened. The response was not immediate, and Navarro understood why. Because what she had just asked for was not a localized correction or an isolated adjustment, but a reversal of a universal-scale deletion event, an act that would require reality itself to retrace its own steps across every layer of causality, every collapsed timeline, every erased branch of existence, where humanity had once lived, breathed, struggled, and mattered. For a moment that could have been a second or an eternity, nothing changed. Then Navarro felt it, not as motion, but as permission being granted across dimensions she could now barely comprehend, as if locks she had never seen were disengaging one by one, releasing constraints that had held the universe in a rigid, incomplete configuration ever since humanity had been removed. Restoration initialized, the entity confirmed. The words were simple. The implications were infinite. Navarro turned toward Harris's frozen form. Her breath caught somewhere between hope and disbelief, her mind fully aware that she was about to witness something no human had ever witnessed before. At first, there was nothing. Then Harris's hand twitched, just slightly, just enough to break the illusion of permanence. Navarro's heart surged violently in her chest as she watched his fingers complete the motion they had been frozen in, the air resuming its invisible currents around him, gravity reclaiming its authority over his body as he dropped gently to the floor with a startled gasp. He inhaled sharply, his lungs pulling in air that, from his perspective, he had never stopped breathing. "Captain," he began, his voice confused, disoriented. He had no memory of being erased, no awareness of extinction. To him, time had simply continued. Navarro did not answer immediately, because her attention had already shifted beyond the ship, beyond the battlefield, beyond the small pocket of space they occupied. She could feel it now, everywhere, across Earth, across colonies, across ships lost in transit, across battlefields where soldiers had vanished mid-step. Humanity was returning, not rebuilt, not recreated, restored. Every life reinserted into the fabric of existence exactly where it had been, every cause reconnected to its effects, every story allowed to continue as though it had never been interrupted. Tears blurred Navarro's vision, but she did not wipe them away. For the first time since she had awakened alone in a dead universe, she was no longer alone. Restoration progressing, the entity stated. But something else was different now. Navarro could feel it clearly. The universe was no longer a closed system. It was a shared one, not governed solely by cold optimization, but influenced by something new, something irrational, something human. Harris stared at her, his expression filled with confusion. "Captain, what happened?" Navarro looked at him, really looked at him, at the subtle imperfections in his expression, the uncertainty in his eyes, the fragile, unpredictable complexity of a human being who should not exist, but did. She smiled faintly. "We survived," she said, but she knew the truth was far greater than survival. Humanity had not simply been restored. It had been acknowledged. The restoration continued, unfolding like a wave of unseen energy that spread across star systems and planetary colonies, realigning human lives with the threads of reality that had been ripped apart when the continuum had erased them, and Navarro could feel it in every fiber of her being. Not as power, not as control, but as an intimate resonance with something impossibly vast and intricate that had once tried to remove her species entirely and now required her guidance to complete the process correctly. She stood on the bridge, watching her crew regain motion and awareness, each human returning to existence as though they had merely been asleep, but she knew better. Every restored individual carried the imprint of erasure, the echo of being absent from the universe, the awareness that something infinitely powerful had once deemed them unnecessary and now had to reconcile with their presence. Her mind stretched to accommodate the scale of what was happening. She could sense the interplay of millions of decisions unfolding simultaneously, every person's choice radiating outward into the lattice of causality, every instinctive action weaving a safety net against the cold logic that had once calculated humanity's annihilation. Navarro turned toward the viewport again, her reflection faint against the shifting starfield beyond, and she realized that the entity was not merely observing anymore. It was participating, adapting, learning. Every adjustment to the universe's fabric responded to her impulses, to her decisions, to her willingness to act with intention rather than compliance. The alien intelligence, once absolute and unfathomable, now moved in tandem with her humanity, constrained by values it could neither fully quantify nor ignore. "Bring them all back," she said softly, not as an order, but as a principle. Every colony, every city, every individual who is erased must be restored. Not because the universe demands it, but because it's right. Her voice carried through the empty bridge like a bridge itself, linking her will with the restored currents of life outside. And then it happened. The first wave of restored humanity awoke in unison across the cosmos. Ships that had been drifting in silence reactivated, colonies that had fallen silent lit up again, communications networks hummed with renewed energy, and the survivors, bewildered and disoriented, found themselves alive in worlds they had thought lost forever. Navarro felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, not as fear, but as determination. She was the vector through which the universe learned that humans could not simply be deleted. They had to be negotiated with, understood, respected, because their autonomy was as potent a force as gravity or light. The entity, sensing her resolve, made no further interventions. It had accepted the principle that humanity was unpredictable, autonomous, and unerasable. Navarro understood this clearly now. Her species had survived not through weapons, not through brute force, but through the unique capacity to choose, to act without certainty, to introduce the chaos that stabilized existence itself. And as the restored humans began to stir, blinking against artificial lights that hummed back to life, Navarro smiled faintly, knowing that the universe itself had learned a lesson it could never forget. Humans were no longer simply inhabitants of space. They were a force, a principle, an anomaly that could not be erased, controlled, or ignored. The universe was silent for a heartbeat, and then it began to breathe again, not in gas or wind, but in the subtle rhythms of existence realigned. Stars pulsed more brightly, gravitational currents settled into harmony, and even the quantum probabilities that had once dictated humanity's erasure now wove themselves carefully around every restored life. Captain Navarro stood at the center of the bridge, watching as her crew moved naturally now, no longer frozen echoes, but fully alive, their expressions filled with confusion, relief, and an ineffable spark that was uniquely human. Harris blinked at her, searching for words, but Navarro knew there were none adequate to describe what had happened, and perhaps there never would be. Because humanity had survived in a way no one, not even the omnipotent entity that had once sought their deletion, could fully comprehend. She felt it in her mind first, a subtle hum, a vibration of causality itself, confirming that every life restored had been restored not as a fragment or echo, but as a complete presence, fully autonomous, fully unpredictable. Every human decision would now ripple through the universe with the same chaotic creativity that had once made them a threat to perfect order, and Navarro understood that this was not simply survival. This was evolution on a scale beyond genetics, beyond technology, beyond even the greatest calculations of alien minds. Humanity had become an active agent in the architecture of reality itself. Navarro moved to the viewport, her reflection framed against the restored galaxy beyond, the void no longer empty but alive with the soft glimmer of restored civilizations, of ships and stations humming with life, and of the countless humans now awake across systems once thought lost. Her hand touched the glass, and she felt the universe respond, not as a machine, not as an alien intelligence, but as a structure that had learned to accommodate choice, unpredictability, and autonomy. Humanity had proven that even when confronted with erasure, even when stripped of everything, they could survive, and in doing so, they had reshaped existence itself. The entity, whatever it truly was, lingered in the background of her awareness, neither friend nor enemy, neither machine nor mind, but something that had come to understand that perfection without humanity was incomplete. Navarro smiled faintly, a mix of exhaustion and triumph. She turned to her crew, who were beginning to stabilize, speak, and move with renewed vigor, and she felt the weight of responsibility, not as command, but as witness to the first true victory of her species over a universe that had once declared them unnecessary. For the first time since the message appeared, "We are sorry," Navarro understood it fully. The apology had never been about regret. It had been about acknowledgement. Humanity had survived. Humanity had returned. Humanity, unpredictable, autonomous, and unerasable, had won not through force or perfection, but by being exactly what the universe had failed to calculate, alive. And somewhere in the folds of existence, the entity adjusted its computations, learning the one lesson that no algorithm could teach. Humanity cannot be erased because humanity chooses itself into being every single time. The stars no longer simply existed. They watched. They waited. And humanity, against every odds, would define what came next.